All right, good afternoon, and thank you for all being here today. It's exciting that here we are in Massasoit Community College Conference Center having a blue carbon conference when 5 years ago there were fewer than probably 2 tables worth of people who were actually thinking and talking about this. So it's come a really long way, in part a result of this project. So just a real quick introduction. If you're not familiar with Restore America's Estuaries, we are an alliance of 11 Save the Bay community-based organizations based all over the coastal United States. And our mission is really about protecting and restoring these vitally important resources. And I don't have to tell you why they're so important. Other audiences we sometimes do. A couple years ago, a couple years ago, the playing field was different in blue carbon. Lisa Marie had that nice chart showing all the different research now that's moving in this direction. In October, the White House released its priority agenda for natural resources resiliency, and blue carbon is called out in that agenda. So that's an exciting development. Last year, also, the IPCC issued their new wetland supplemental guidance for accounting for greenhouse gas-related emissions and reductions in wetlands, including blue carbon ecosystems. So there's a lot going on now. The context for this meeting, there's a big global and national context that I just want you to all be aware of. And as a national mission-driven nonprofit organization, we're trying to move this forward, mostly at the US level, but also dabbling in international as much as we can. So, greenhouse gases, they're global in scope. Now I see why everyone is looking over this way, because there's no monitor here. So, and they're global pollutants, and also they can be measured and they can be compared to each other. So it kind of lends itself to a market-based approach for reducing global emissions. And all greenhouse gases are not equal, and you've heard this reference to a little bit this morning already. But methane has a much greater global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And actually the latest IPCC number is 34 times greater. The markets are still using 21, so somewhere in there. And again, it depends on the time horizon, as Lisa Marie pointed out this morning. And then nitrous oxide, it's 310 times more potent over a 100-year period for its global warming potential. And so the markets take that into account, which means if you go out and reduce a ton of methane that's being released into the atmosphere and you stop that from happening, that's 34 times or 21 times better and potentially more valuable than a ton of CO2 offsets. So you need to think about that when you're thinking about what kinds of projects you might want to do. And the market story, the bigger market story, I think, too, is why we're so interested in this. 5 years ago, there was actually the possibility of U.S. cap-and-trade legislation 5-6 years ago. And we positioned wetlands, coastal wetlands, and we worked very hard to do this so that it would be included as a potential offset category in any U.S. legislation. And that would have been a market worth billions and billions of dollars, and so everybody was like lining up at the trough, right? Well, that didn't happen. But I am pleased to say that there is a voluntary market, and I'll talk about that in a moment too, that also provides substantial private investment in carbon offsets, and that's what we're trying to tap into. So when we say what is a carbon market, basically it's just that collection of all the payments, all the transactions for offsets generated by third parties. And an offset then equates to that 1 ton reduction of CO2 in 1 year. And you can equate that again across the different greenhouse gases, and that's called a CO2e, or equivalent. And that's terminology you'll see in the market setting. And then, yeah, there are either compliance or voluntary markets. The compliance ones are driven by government regulation. Pretty straightforward, I think, so far. So in the compliance market, regulated entities, and you can target different sectors of the emissions and pollutants, right, are required to meet certain targets. And so there are allowances. They're given a certain amount that they're allowed to pollute, and then if they can't If they can't get to that level, they can then purchase offsets or they can improve their own practices to reduce their emissions. Capping that and reducing that cap over time is a way of reducing globally, the amount of pollutants going into the atmosphere. And it also provides a financial incentive for companies to improve what they're doing, save money that way, and also for offsets then to start to be generated in a market. It creates a market for offsets. Whether or not you think cap and trade is a good idea, that's a great discussion to have at another time. And we basically, as Restore America's Estuaries, we see this as an opportunity to drive new investment in coastal habitat restoration and protection, something that's vitally needed. And so I won't tell you my personal opinion about cap and trade, but it's a potential source of funds, so I want to tap into it. That's the perspective that I come to this from. Globally, also under the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol, all the signatory countries, they have caps that they're required to meet. And so there is a global compliance market on the tens and I think actually a couple $100 billion annually scale. We don't play in that as the US. So here we focus mostly on the voluntary market. But there's one major exception to that and one less major, and that's the California Global Warming Solutions Act. So they, in 2010, I think, passed some legislation, and they want to reduce their statewide emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And so they set a cap, and you can see how they started at 2012 levels, a little bit below that, and then they start bringing it down every year. And it covers all major industries and 85% of all the emissions in the state. And so again, they grant allowances to different industrial sectors and specific companies. And then they also, initially they started off by just giving them away. And now they actually give away less than the companies need, and they sell the remainder, and the companies can bid on them. This is a revenue generating opportunity for the state. And in fact, the state took some of that money just this year and put it into $21 million worth of wetland restoration projects that they just announced in the last couple weeks. So that, in my mind, is the first really substantial blue carbon funding that's happened. And these projects, they're not offset projects. The state is funding them because of all the ecological values they provide, but also because of the climate mitigation value. And so it's a really, I think, exciting development. I don't know if they have plans to continue it. Hopefully they do. In California, companies can use offsets to meet 8% of their obligation. So you can't offset 100% of your emissions, just 8%. They have just five approved categories for offsets so far, and one of those is forestry, and they're also exploring forestry or RED projects, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation in Mexico and Brazil. So they're exploring other options. And they can look outside of California and even the US because these are global pollutants, right? I think the other market example I'll use, compliance-based, is RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. For the folks living up here, do you know that you're in a state that's in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative? Sort of. Yeah. So this regulates the power sector. It's cap and trade for them. So far, they haven't needed offsets, but they do have approved offset categories. And it has, I think mostly what happened is the power sector switched to natural gas, and because of the way they do the accounting, that met all their obligations. So they didn't need to do anything else. So they're trying to figure out how to make it, I think, a more impactful system right now. And if I mangled any of that, apologies to folks who might be more familiar with RGGI, but that's my impression of it. But there's an opportunity there, so if they do move into offsets, we should be looking at that. So shifting to the voluntary side, the voluntary market, since tracking of these offsets began, is large, $4 billion worth, and almost 1 billion tons of offsets have been generated and transacted through different means of people buying and selling these. In 2013, the most recent year that they tracked the numbers, And most of this data comes from that report that's highlighted there, sharing the stage. It's the Ecosystem Marketplace, does the State of the Voluntary Carbon Market report. They do it every year, and it is a tremendous resource if you're interested in exploring this in any more detail. So in 2013, the average price was just under $5 a ton in the voluntary market, and that actually came down a little bit from previous year. Part of that's because the California market started to grow and people were shifting into the regulatory market because the price is higher. Interestingly, 20% of the market is for early stage, which basically means it supports project development and new initiatives, as opposed to offsets that have already been issued and are then sold. And that's where we are with coastal wetland projects right now. And almost half were in the forestry and land use sector, and they expect it to grow to $1.8 billion, so what's that, about fivefold by 2020. And companies do this voluntarily, and they ask them why, and the two leading reasons are because they care about climate change. They want to help reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and also because they care about how they're viewed and what kind of player they are in the communities where they operate. So standards, these are independent organizations that set the rules for what counts as an offset. And there are three major standards in the US and the voluntary market: the Verified Carbon Standard, the American Carbon Registry, and the Climate Action Reserve. And I'll go more into that in a second. Registries then are how you track a credit and make sure you're not double counting or somebody's not selling the same credit twice. It's a little bit like a stock exchange in that way. And then methodologies are what you need if you want to do a project to get credits. It's a set of conditions and requirements and accounting procedures that you have to follow for the specific type of project that you're doing in order to get offsets. The standards are really set up to ensure, like I said, the quality and integrity of the offsets. They don't want to issue offsets to something that really doesn't have an impact on our net global greenhouse gas emissions, right? We're trying to bring that down. And it's not cap and trade, it's not regulatory driven, these are voluntary actions. So they're very rigorous, they're very complex at times, and these are some of the principles that they all are trying to follow. The three that I mentioned all have this in common, right? And it's just how they apply each of these principles in practice that differs from one to the other. I'm only going to touch on one or two of these right now. Permanence. We work in the coastal zone, a dynamic system, sea level rise, storms, and so that is one that we need to make sure we're addressing very carefully. You don't want to create something and capture the carbon and then have it be released back to the atmosphere. And practicality, and that's been the hardest one, because these are very rigorous, complex systems that are set up for issuing offsets. So we worked really hard. We're a mission-driven nonprofit. We want to provide tools that you all can use to do projects and get offsets and more finance for what you're doing. And I'll touch more on that. I'm up again after this, right? Yeah, so you get me twice in a row. On the voluntary side, this just shows who's issuing the credits on an annual basis. Verified Carbon Standard is all of this section in blue. And sometimes the standards operate, these are just carbon offsets that they're counting, but there's also the community and something biodiversity standard, the CCB. And so you can mix and match. You can layer things on top of each other and create more value. And so that's the blue is the VCS. And that's why I showed that slide. And that's who we've mostly worked with so far, is the Verified Carbon Standard. And again, you can see that these are different categories of offsets. The majority, like the vast, not the majority, but the biggest share is in the land use sector. So the things that you might want to do, or that we might want to do that have greenhouse gas benefits, and we haven't really touched on this too much yet, is either to restore or to create or to conserve or protect wetlands. Right? And I won't go into the hows and whys, and I think some of that's been captured a little bit, and I'll do that later when we talk, especially tomorrow when we talk about the methodology in a more in-depth session. And the other thing is that the markets, they only allow credits for the difference that you make, right? So you should only get a credit for the impact of your project. And so how do you know what the impact of your project is? Well, you have to know what would have happened if you didn't do your project, right? And that's called the baseline, or the business as usual scenario. And so these are 4 different things that could happen in a landscape. You could have a neutral baseline with no emissions right now, okay? Or no reductions either, no carbon sequestration going on. And you put in your project and you create a ongoing carbon sequestration benefit. You get credit for that difference, okay, over time. You can have a degrading baseline, maybe methane emissions in a tidally restricted salt marsh area. And you restore tidal flows, you've basically now stopped that emission and maybe improved your carbon sequestration rates. So you've stopped a negative emission, or stopped an emission and added in carbon sequestration. You get credit for that whole difference. And the last 2 are probably self-explanatory. You can have a baseline situation where you have some good activities already happening from a greenhouse gas perspective. You improve it. So that's a smaller difference, but you still get credit. And then the same on the reverse. So where we are now is the verified carbon standard is the only standard that has a specific category for wetlands and greenhouse gas offsets. And that's called the WRC, the Wetland Restoration and Conservation. It includes those 3 things I mentioned a moment ago: restoration, conservation, and creation. And we are developing, and it's written and going through approvals, and I'll share more about that in just a second, the methodology for greenhouse gas offsets for tidal wetland and seagrass restoration. And then you move to project development, and then you get your reductions and removals, you quantify them, and you get your offsets. And so I think this is actually my last slide, so there's our timing. And so I will stop there. I think we're going to do questions on the market piece. Okay.
If somebody restores or creates a wetland, is there a monitoring requirement?
For offsets?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, sort of. What we tried to do, I'll get to this a little bit more in the methodology, what we tried to do is provide different options for people to demonstrate that the project had a greenhouse gas benefit and to quantify it. And so there is some monitoring requirement. There's a verification. Can we go back? We can. There it is. So I didn't touch on the verification piece. So all greenhouse gas projects are verified at least twice. And they actually use different words for the different times that they are. But when you first develop your project, there's a validation of your approach to doing the greenhouse gas accounting and monitoring. And does it meet the methodology requirements and the requirements in the standard? So that's the first time you have an independent review. The second time is when you actually submit your project and you say, I've created this many offsets. There's a verification then. And so people will come out, they'll look, make sure you did a project, they'll see how does it compare to what you said you would do. So there'll be some monitoring by a third party, and then depending on how you set the project up, you'll probably have at least some, but maybe a lot of monitoring requirements as you go.
Just looking at a whole bunch of projects, I'm wondering, do you know any wetland restoration project that's been taken on just for the carbon credits? And then if not, what about the other world of forestry and land use? And like, are they doing projects that are just based on carbon? Or are they incorporating multiple benefits or two?
Right. So one of the points that David made this morning, and I think is a very important one, is that we should stop talking about co-benefits and start talking about benefits, right? And I totally agree. And the reason that we talk about just the greenhouse gas piece is because that's where there's a market. Other ecosystem services, there really aren't voluntary markets right now that are substantial, driving new activity that I'm aware of. And if I'm wrong about that, David, let me know. So there are some regulatory things popping up for other services like water quality, nutrient reduction, et cetera. So right now, in terms of wetlands, I don't know of any projects that are happening just for the carbon piece. I'm not sure I would want them to, right? I mean, we don't want to create carbon farms necessarily, and And I should have said that at the beginning. I mean, we're mission driven and we're all about protecting and restoring these for the numerous values they provide. And this, are looking at this as a driver to do that, but not to control what the projects look like. And there's still safeguards for that. So I'm sort of answering your question, I think. Around the world, there are folks interested in using the methodology, and it is, we'll get to that in the next little bit here. So we could have just done this as one talk, but we split it up to allow people a chance to digest the market piece before we move to the methodology piece, I think. So.